In the summer of 1944, a ghost story began to haunt Allied tank crews fighting their way through France. It was a story of a new German monster, a 70-ton beast of steel and fury with armor so thick it laughed at their shells and a gun so powerful it could kill from a mile away. They called it the Königstiger, and for American tankers it was their worst nightmare. But what if the terrifying legend of this invincible predator was a lie? What if its greatest enemy wasn't an Allied shell, but a catastrophic flaw hidden deep within its own steel heart? The fear spread through the lines like a disease. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture of an unstoppable force. The Königstiger's frontal armor was over 7 inches thick and sloped at an angle that made it virtually impenetrable to any tank gun the Allies had. A Sherman's 75mm shell, which could handle most German tanks, would simply bounce off. Even the upgraded 76mm gun struggled to leave a scratch. Meanwhile, the Königstiger's own weapon, the legendary 8.18mm gun, could punch straight through a Sherman's armor from over 2 kilometers away, a distance where the Sherman crew couldn't even dream of fighting back. The psychological impact was devastating. For Allied tankers, facing a Königstiger head-on was a suicide mission. The legend was born. Germany had unleashed an invincible supertank. But that legend was about to meet a harsh reality. To man these new titans, Germany didn't just pick any soldiers. They chose the elite. The crews assigned to the first Königsteigers in Normandy were hardened veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, men who had survived the hell of Kursk and stared down hundreds of Soviet tanks. Their confidence was absolute. They had seen what German engineering could do, and when they laid eyes on the Königstiger, they believed they were looking at the weapon that would finally turn the tide of the war. Standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing twice as much as a Sherman, the tank was a fortress on tracks. These elite crews were ready to show the Americans and British what true armored dominance looked like, and what happened next would shock everyone. In mid-July 1944, the orders came down. 5 brand-new Königsteigers from the 316th Panzer Company were to move to the front lines, a journey of just 80 kilometers through the French countryside. With their veteran crews eager for a fight, the engines roared to life. This was it, the debut of Germany's war-winning weapon. But barely 10 kilometers into the journey, the unthinkable happened. The lead tank's transmission began to grind itself to pieces. The massive gearbox, not designed for the tank's immense weight, catastrophically failed. The invincible supertank was dead on the road, blocking the entire column. 1 down, 4 to go. But this was just the beginning. The remaining 4 tanks pressed on, their crews now uneasy. 15 kilometers later, a second Königstiger's engine began to scream. The cooling system, pushed beyond its limits, couldn't handle the heat. Steam billowed from the engine deck as the coolant boiled away, and within minutes the engine seized solid. 2 down, 3 remaining. The panic was setting in. These weren't isolated incidents. Another 20 kilometers and a third tank U.S. final drive. The massive gears connecting the transmission to the tracks stripped its teeth and locked up. 3 down. Finally, just 30 kilometers from the front, a 4th tank's suspension gave out, throwing its track and leaving it crippled. Of the 5 supertanks that set out that morning, only 1 limped to the front lines. 4 had been defeated without seeing a single enemy, destroyed by their own engineering. The truth was, the Königstiger was a mechanical disaster. It was a case of ambition completely outrunning engineering reality. The problem was simple. The tank was far too heavy for its own components. German engineers had rushed it into production, taking parts from existing, lighter tanks and hoping they would work. The transmission was a slightly modified version of the one used in the 45-ton Panther. In the 70-ton Königstiger, it was a ticking time bomb, destined to tear itself apart. The 700-horsepower Maybach engine was also the same one used in the Panther, making the Königstiger desperately underpowered. Its power-to-weight ratio was so poor that the engine was constantly running at maximum output just to move, causing it to overheat and seize. The myth of German engineering perfection was a fantasy. In reality, the King Tiger was an over-engineered, under-tested catastrophe on tracks, and what happened next proved this wasn't a one-time failure. This pattern of disaster would repeat itself on an even grander scale during Germany's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. The spearhead of the attack, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was equipped with around 45 King Tigers. It was meant to be an unstoppable armored fist. But from the very beginning, the offensive was plagued by mechanical failures. Dozens of King Tigers broke down on the march, littering the roads of the Ardennes. The few that did reach the front lines engaged in fierce fighting, but their advance was ultimately halted not by American guns, but by a lack of fuel. Their gas-guzzling engines burned through supplies at a terrifying rate. Famously, at the Belgian village of L'Église, Peiper was forced to abandon his remaining King Tigers, including the iconic Tank 213. They were completely out of fuel and immobile. The invincible weapon was, once again, nothing more than a 70-ton paperweight. As Allied forces advanced, they began to stumble upon these abandoned steel giants. At first, they approached with extreme caution, expecting a trap. But they found only silence. The crews were long gone, having destroyed what they could and fled on foot. For American engineers, these captured tanks were an intelligence goldmine. They crawled over every inch, and what they discovered changed everything. They confirmed the armor was incredible and the gun was terrifying. But when they examined the drivetrain, they were shocked. One American engineer from Detroit wrote that no U.S. automobile manufacturer would have ever approved such a weak design for a vehicle of that weight. Soviet engineers who captured 2 King Tigers on the Eastern Front came to the same conclusion. During testing, the tanks broke down every 10 to 15 kilometers. The legend was officially dead. The King Tiger was exposed as a fragile, unreliable liability. Ultimately, the King Tiger's greatest failure was not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. Over the course of the war, Germany managed to produce just 492 King Tigers. Each one consumed enormous amounts of resources, time, and skilled labor. For the same cost, Germany could have built 2 or 3 of the more reliable Panther tanks. In that same period, the United States produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The industrial math was brutal and unforgiving. While German engineers were chasing the dream of a perfect, invincible supertank, American factories were churning out thousands of good-enough reliable tanks that could actually get to the battlefield and stay there. Germany was not just losing the war, it was being buried under an avalanche of American steel. In the end, the King Tiger remains one of the most famous tanks in history, a symbol of terrifying power. But its true story is one of failure. It was a weapon so over-engineered and complex that it became its own worst enemy. The vast majority were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdowns, fuel exhaustion, and abandonment. Its true legacy wasn't its combat record, but the powerful lesson it taught the victors. American designers learned that the most powerful gun is worthless if the tank can't reach the fight, and the thickest armor is useless if the engine gives out. The war would be won not by the best tank, but by the most tanks that actually worked. A lesson written in the trail of broken-down steel left by Germany's greatest failure. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of engineering triumph and disaster as fascinating as I did, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next one.